comes from not enforcing the law. When whether it be migrants or any smugglers or anybody else see the laws not enforced, they will abuse those laws. And we've seen increased brazenness by cartels that feel empowered because we do not have a federal government that's pushing back against those cartels and their illegal activity. And of course, the worst thing of all is the catastrophic death that we have witnessed. Now, we saw this horrendous death occur in a truck in San Antonio earlier this week, and it is heartbreaking. The numbers have increased. It is now reported that 53 people in that truck lost their lives. It is the deadliest migrant smuggling incident on U.S. soil, and it's on President Biden's watch. The thing about it is that it's not the only way in which people who are trying to migrate here lose their lives. In the harsh, high temperature of Texas in the summertime and the Texas heat, it'll prove even more deadly. Every year there are many reports about migrants who lose their lives in the heat. I was visiting with the sheriff moments ago, and he was telling me reports about how there have been multiple people in just the past week who had lost their lives, mostly from heat exhaustion. There may have been, in addition to that, one or two who lost their lives in the river. This is harsh terrain and harsh weather. And because of the way that the Biden administration is not enforcing the immigration laws, it's attracting people and enticing people to make this very dangerous trek, causing them to lose their lives. I urge the president, stop the loss of lives. You have the ability to stop people from losing their lives if you make it clear that no one can come across illegally. There's a perfectly legal way that people can immigrate to the United States of America. It's that legal pathway, Mr. President, that you must insist upon. And if you do that, you will have a role in reducing the loss of life. Now, going back, many of these deaths could be prevented if Biden simply fully funded the Border Patrol operation of the United States of America and implemented the policies that the Border Patrol needs in order to do their real job. And the real job is not the paper processing work that they've been assigned to do. The real job is both to secure the border as well as to do things like inspect the vehicle that was carrying those people who lost their lives. As you all surely know, the truck passed through a border point checkpoint. It was not inspected. It was not inspected because the Border Patrol does not have the resources to be able to inspect all of the trucks. And as a result, the Border Patrol did not have the capability of saving those lives. Mr. President, you can fix that if you provide what is categorized as the minimum number of Border Patrol officers who are needed to do the fundamental job of the United States of America and adequately fund their operations to make sure that they are going to be able to inspect those vehicles. Well, in Texas, we once again are going to try to step up and play a role by the state to address this catastrophe that President Biden is responsible for. Today, I'm announcing that Texas is going to add additional truck checkpoints. DPS will create and implement a checkpoint strategy beginning immediately where they will begin targeting trucks like the one that was used where these people perished to make sure that we will have a better capability of perhaps stopping future trucks like that, as well as stopping the smugglers and the cartel members who are trying to profiteer off of it. Now, we're in Eagle Pass today for a reason. Eagle Pass is part of the Del Rio sector, and the Del Rio sector has seen the largest number of illegal crossings in the past week. There was a time when most of the illegal crossings would take place in the Rio Grande Valley, and that's no longer true. Right now, we're at ground zero here into Del Rio. where we have the largest number of border crossings, and we have information indicating that there could be a meaningful rise in the number of border crossings in this region. So we want to step up and make sure that we will do more to better secure this area. As the mayor told me earlier, he said the situation in Eagle Pass has gone from bad to worse with the increased number of people coming through this area. The bottom line is this: despite the increasing numbers, despite these caravans on the Mexico side of the border right now, the Biden administration still is doing nothing whatsoever to stop it. Texas is going to take action to do our part to try to reduce the illegal immigration coming into our country. We're going to be adding more resources and stronger strategies to control all the borderland that is owned or controlled by state or local governments. Let me make clear what I just said. The property along the border is owned or controlled typically by three different groups. There is some property that's owned or controlled by state or local governments. This property we're on right now is controlled by the local government. There's other property that's owned or controlled by the state. However, there is some property on the border that is owned or controlled by the federal government. If it's owned or controlled by the federal government, Texas does not have the authority or the capability to stop the illegal immigrants from going to that land. There's another area that we are working on, and that is private property. There are people, whether it be in this community or people up and down the border, who own property on the border. We are getting authorization from as many of them as we can for the state of Texas to be able to put up barriers, whether it be concertina wire or fences or other types of barriers, so we can prevent people from entering the United States and the state of Texas through that private property. Along these lines, I'm announcing a couple of new strategies that we're adding on to what we are already doing so that Texas can gain even greater operational control of the property owned by the state of Texas or local governments or private property owners. We are creating two strike teams. The Texas Department of Public Safety is creating two strike teams to detect, deter, and apprehend unlawful crossings of illegal immigrants. Two strike teams deployed, they will be deployed immediately right here in Eagle Pass. Each team will consist of 20 troopers. Additional strike teams will be deployed to high traffic crossing areas as needed. Separate, and in addition to that, the National Guard is taking additional action. By the way, it's important to point out that the National Guard, they've been deployed to the Texas border for more than a year now, many of whom are with us here today, and we appreciate their tireless around-the-clock effort to do everything they can to help secure the border. But what they are focused on right now is deploying additional miles of concertina military-grade razor wire along the Rio Grande River, protecting areas from entry by people illegally. In addition to that, the National Guard is adding miles of fencing and barriers on state and local property, once again prioritizing the high-traffic areas. And they are also going to be adding boat teams where feasible along the river. One thing that they have been involved in and been very aggressive about already, they have numbered more than 22,000 turnbacks of people who were trying to come across the border that they turn back. That is an essential role of what the National Guard is helping us to achieve.